I'm going to talk today about hybrid warfare. As you can see from this picture, it's very much connected to what we know from the conflict in Ukraine. However, as you will see pretty soon, it has not only to do with Ukraine. Actually, we are talking about something that was there for a long time. Today, I tell you what is hybrid warfare. We look at the word, we look at the definitions and different types, and then we look at Ukraine and at possible solutions from a social science perspective. One definition that is around is from two colonels of the Chinese army, Colonel Zhang Yang and Colonel Wang Jiangsui. And they defined it as unrestricted war. Unrestricted war is a war that surpasses all boundaries and restrictions. It takes non-military forms and military forms, and it creates a war on many fronts. It is, as they say, the war of the future. The word hybrid stems from Latin, and it means assembled, crossbred, or mixed. The case was first introduced by Major William Nemeth in the Future War and Chechnya, a case of hybrid warfare. Chechnya, conflict within Russia, so not about Ukraine. And here his definition was hybrid war is a society-specific war or warfare which combine irregular and regular tactics with more modern measures. Then we had John McCone, hybrid wars, and he again doesn't talk about Ukraine, but he analyzed Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And he said that hybrid wars are fought on three distinct battlegrounds: the conventional battlefield, the general public and population of the attacked country. In Vietnam, this was called minds and souls. You should win the minds of the people in order to win a conflict. And then the home population and international public. The Vietnam War, for example, was lost in the United States because the people of the United States didn't believe anymore that America could win the war. So the home population and the international public is very important as well. Frank Hoffman, in his Conflict of the 21st Century, wrote about the rise of hybrid wars, and actually he analyzed the Lebanese war in 2006, which was basically a war between Hezbollah and the Israeli army. So another conflict long before Ukraine. And he defines hybrid threats incorporate a full range of different modes of warfare, including conventional capabilities, irregular tactics and formations, terrorist acts, including indiscriminate violence and coercion, and criminal disorders. Hybrid wars can be conducted by both states and a variety of non-state actors. So states, for example, in Lebanon, who were engaged with Syria, the Lebanese army, the Israeli army, but there were various non-state actors, various militias, such as the Hezbollah. These multimodal activities are generally operationally and tactically directed and coordinated within the main battle space to achieve synergic effects in the physical and physiological dimensions of the conflict. Russell Glenn, in his thoughts on hybrid conflict, basically said that it's always a combination of different aspects. It's politically, militarily, economically, and information means that are combined together as a concept of new battle. So the question is basically that we are having unconventional forms of battle. It's not two armies who are meeting each other on the battlefield. It is a combination of many things. So is this anything new? That is the real question. And the real answer is no. We had this in the entire history of warfare. If you look at the Second Punic War, maybe you know it from history, maybe not, but probably you've heard about Hannibal.
Yes.
Yeah, and Hannibal came over the Alps to attack Rome, and he used war elephants. So this is a conventional thing. So what did the Romans do? They instigated uprisings against Hannibal's troop in various districts, and this was unconventional. So already in the Punic War we had this kind of thing. In the Vietnam War, very unconventional methods were used. Guerrilla warfare was used on behalf of the Viet Cong. Then we had Kosovo, where we had the UÇK, an Albanian guerrilla group. Afghanistan, no question about that, there unconventional methods were used. Iraq, Lebanon, as already mentioned, and recently in Libya. So hybrid war is nothing new. It is new that we call it hybrid war. So what kind of, or what types of war we have? First of all, it's waging war against another state by using non-state actors, so-called proxies. In Ukraine, for example, officially there is no Russian army engaged. There are volunteers and there are local Russian militias, but officially there is no direct engagement on behalf of the Red Army. So they use proxies, even so there might be real Russian forces on the ground as well. The problem with proxies is they have sometimes their own agendas. They have their own programs. You can't control them as much as an army. Army very strictly follows orders. But if you have a proxy group, the proxy group might have their own interest. You could see it, for example, the independence of Lugansk and Donetsk was declared before Putin actually approved it. So sometimes you can't directly control this group. Then we have different use of force. Terrorist attacks, guerrilla tactics, conventional warfare. Then hybrid war is always a limited war. It has a singular political aim: regime change or creation of spheres of influence. And very important, it's stealthy. That means it's covered. You can't really find out who did it. The principle behind here is a plausible deniability. There were no Russian troops in Ukraine. Of course, we don't believe it, but as long as the public in Russia believes it, it's plausible. You say, we had nothing to do with it. Plausible deniability. Then we had political, moral, and economic support that is given to hybrid warfare. And it's very much a propaganda thing. It's propaganda warfare, it's media warfare. You all know the Russian TV station RT. The Russian TV station RT is the best vehicle for Russian propaganda in this field. On top we have subversion and cyber attacks. Then of course you have direct and conventional military support and employment of special forces. Remember what happened in the Crimea? Suddenly there were, we call them little green men, and the little green men were people without any insignias, but they were Russian special forces. So you use special forces for special tasks without calling them official members of a given army. Andras Raj, in his Russia's hybrid warfare on Ukraine, is actually giving out how to organize such a warfare, and he's using actually the example of the Crimea. So you have a preparatory phase in which you prepare your strategy, your politics, and your operations. So you prepare yourself for it. Then the attack phase, in which suddenly you have this little green man everywhere. And finally, you have the stabilization phase. You have a referendum in the Crimea, people vote for being part of Russia, and then you send in more Russian troops and you stabilize and secure the borders, and then everything is done, and the hybrid war with a limited aim of occupying Crimea was won. If we now look at the case of Ukraine, we see that we have various actors that are interested in the situation in Ukraine. First of all, Ukraine and its forces. Then, irregular insurgents. Those were the irregular troops in eastern Ukraine and in the Crimea. Then we had, of course, the United States of America and NATO. NATO's role in Ukraine is a little bit mixed. NATO gave very often the impression to Ukraine that in due course, in the future, there might be a possibility that Ukraine will be member of NATO. Actually, NATO never promised this. There's no NATO decision that Ukraine will be member of NATO. But there was some cooperation, they are in a partnership program, and through this, some people in the Ukraine might have got the idea, eventually they will be member of NATO. Now, the other actor is Russia. Russia feared that exactly this will happen. They feared first Ukraine will be member of European Union, and then they will be member of the NATO. And then there's no more Russian influence in the region. So they actually promoted a different idea. They said Ukraine should be member of the Eurasian Union. That's a union of states that are together with Russia, trying to build an economic market like the European Union, not very successful, neither economically nor integration-wise, but that is a proposal that you have. Then Germany and the European Union together, who had the aim of bringing Ukraine closer to the European Union. In the beginning, maybe even with a dream to get Ukraine to be a member of the European Union. But as you all know, we have this fatigue of the European Union. We don't really want more member states at the moment because we have enough troubles among ourselves. So this offer is not as genuine as it was in the beginning, but nevertheless, there is an interest. And then we have, of course, Poland and the Baltic states. Poland and the Baltic states look at Ukraine from a completely different perspective than other members of the NATO, because their neighbor is Russia. And Russian aggression is something that especially is seen as something dangerous to the security not only of Ukraine, but of course as well for Poland and the Baltic states. So they have a special interest to react to what Russia is doing and not to allow Russia to do what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So you have various actors and they have different interests. Even though we are NATO partners, we might have different interests when it comes to getting a settlement of the Ukraine conflict. And there are other things that influence Ukraine that are things that happened before. What we have here is a picture from Iraq. This is Mr. Bremer. Mr. Bremer was heading the interim administration in Iraq, and his aim was to bring democracy to Iraq. Well, the Iraq war was a war that was not covered by any resolution of the Security Council. And so, in terms of traditional international law, the attack on Iraq was illegal. And Russia is now using this argument by saying the Americans don't care about international law, so why shall we care about international law? They violated it. Another case is Kosovo. For Kosovo there was a resolution. This resolution was not allowing the independence of Kosovo, but was allowing that United Nations troops would go under NATO command then finally into Kosovo and would pacify this region, would make it peaceful for the people. But what happened then? Kosovo declared independence without having any agreement with Serbia. So that was again seen on the side of Russia as violation of international law. And so Russia said, okay, if the Americans do that, then we can do the same. So the first thing they did, they accepted the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, parts of Georgia, where there was a previous war. And the Russians say, well, we now accept them as independent states because you accepted Kosovo as an independent state. So international law is a difficult thing in this respect. And then, of course, we had the independence of Kosovo. The independence of the Crimea. And we had, of course, demonstrations against them in Ukraine. And so by terms of international law, it's very, very difficult to solve this problem. Now, if we look at the hybrid warfare and Russia, why is Russia so concerned about it? We have to see that Russia changed its military doctrine since the Georgian War of 2008. In 2008, the government of Georgia tried to recapture Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And they were hoping that they could manage to do this. They were quick, but not quick enough. And the Russians managed to overcome the Georgian attack. However, the Russians found out that the strategy was not good enough and it needed to be revised. And so a new military doctrine was developed. First of all, it came up out a paper by the Russian Chief of Staff, Valery Gerasimov. It's very often called as well the Gerasimov Doctrine, which came out in 2013. In which he said the rules of war have changed fundamentally. The effectiveness of non-military means for achieving strategic or political goals exceeded that of arms. And then you can read all this translated into the new military doctrine, the Russian military doctrine of 2014. So there, the characteristic of contemporary conflicts are the combination of military and non-military means. You can't win a conflict only with military. You have always to combine it. That's the first principle. Secondly, the increased importance of information warfare. You should not only rule over the battlefield, you should rule over the information that people get on what is happening on the battlefield. Then thirdly, inclusion of irregular armed forces. In any given conflict in the future, you have a combination of your armed forces and irregulars, and you use them together. And then, employment of indirect and asymmetrical methods. As a result of this doctrine, the Russians reformed their armed forces. There was a comprehensive military reform with the establishment of small, flexible, and interconnected units. And we saw them especially in the Crimea, where the little green man suddenly appeared. In the Donbass as well. Uniformed units without insignia. As I said, plausible deniability. There are no Russian troops, was the first thing. The second thing was, yes, there might be some Russian troops, but these Russian troops are people on holiday. Okay, taking a tank on a holiday trip is something, okay, a unique idea. But I can assure you, in propaganda terms, most of the Russian people believed it. These people are at best volunteers. Nobody was ordered to fight there. Later, Vladimir Putin actually said, yes, of course we had regular troops there. So he admitted it, but by that time the conflict was already over and won from the Russian perspective. If we now analyze what actually happened in this conflict, and we look at some publications, Peter Pomerantsev wrote How Putin is Reinventing Warfare, and he calls it non-linear war. And Jay Smirnova writes about journalists, Putin's other kind of army. So journalists are part of the armed forces of Putin, who are fighting a war with pens about who is right and who is wrong. And he calls it a kind of indirect war. So the term hybrid warfare came up actually as a definition by NATO as it came to the Ukraine. NATO first mentioned hybrid warfare through the Dutch General Frank van Keppen in a speech on the 22nd April 2014. And then, shortly after, there was a NATO review video of 3rd July 2014, hybrid war, hybrid response, and since then, hybrid warfare is the official or unofficial term used for this kind of warfare on behalf of NATO. If we look at some other things, how this was analyzed, Michael Kaufman and Matthew Rojansky, a closer look at Russia's hybrid warfare. They described that the Crimea began as a covert military operation combining ambiguity, disinformation, and the elements of surprise at the operational level with more traditional aids such as electronic warfare. And the annexation was completed by traditional military invasion, and so on and so on. So the interesting thing is they say it was not a hybrid warfare, it started as a hybrid warfare. In the end, there were regular troops, there were tanks, there were airborne divisions landing, so it ended actually as a really conventional military invasion. They go on to say, and that's very interesting, while the Russians were very successful with these methods in the Crimea, in the other parts of Ukraine they were less successful. Especially Russia's media was not as successful to influence those parts of Ukraine where basically people had the mother tongue of Russian. So in many parts of Ukraine, even so the majority of the population in these areas were Russian speaking, the Russian media was not as influential than it was in the Crimea. So it was not an entire success. It was a success in Luhansk and in Donetsk, but not in other parts of the Ukraine. But what they analyzed as well, RT is a very clever channel because they don't have to prove that they are right. Their aim is to tell us you have to doubt, don't trust the media. That is a basic message they send out. Maybe they are all lying, but if you don't trust the media anymore, then you don't trust any information and you don't have any information. So that is actually the message of RT. It's not Russia is right, but simply question more. Don't believe anything you hear from media. This is the message of RT. And if we all do this, then we don't listen to media at all, and we don't trust any information, and then we are disabled, because without information we can't act. If we look at Kaufman's and Jansky's a closer look to Russia's hybrid war further on, they say a domino-like repetition of a hybrid war is a wrong lens to understand the problem. They say what happened in Ukraine cannot continue like this in other states. It cannot continue, for example, the Baltic states. Yes, in the Baltic states you have a Russian-speaking minority, but you have a Russian-speaking minority that holds, in most cases, a European passport, and that has jobs, and that doesn't want to leave this privilege, even so they might not be happy with the majority governments in this country. So it's far more difficult to influence them in a way like certain minorities in Ukraine were influenced. So what is new about what happened in Ukraine? Going back to Andras Raj, the only real novelty was a highly effective, in many cases almost real-time coordination of the various means employed, including the political, military, special operations and information measures. So it's not totally new hybrid war, but it's just a very new effective use of different tactical measures. Alex Stepp, in his definition of hybrid warfare, again, the title already tells you everything, old concepts and new techniques. So the concept is old, the techniques are new. Poposcu in hybrid tactics, neither new nor only Russian, is going into the same direction. But he says as well that for countries like Ukraine, hybrid warfare was a threat, but for most European countries it wasn't. So he said the danger, of course, for countries like the Baltic states is much smaller. For Poland, it's almost impossible, because you can't tell the Polish population, it doesn't matter what kind of propaganda you tell the Polish population, that Russia is right and you should leave NATO and join Russia. You know, that is not something that is possible, whatever propaganda you try to employ. So he says that such conditions are unlikely to be replicated or on a comparable scale elsewhere. And he says as well that if you look at eastern Ukraine, the conflict started as hybrid conflict, but then it became conventional. And what we have there now in Luhansk and Donetsk is conventional warfare. You have highly armed units on both sides who are facing each other, and there's no hybrid warfare anymore. And so ever since the conflict hasn't been hybrid at all, even so some people still call themselves volunteers. Everybody knows what is going on there. As soon as the Ukrainian army is really attacking heavily, there will be regular Russian troops coming over and confronting them. And that's why the Ukrainians don't try this anymore. So the question is, what we learn out of this, will hybrid warfare in the future be something that we all will use? Well, as I said already, unconventional warfare was used always. Now it's getting more sophisticated, more specialized. So communication technologies facilitate larger scale information operations and cyber attacks that are difficult to trace back. Increased combination with other forms of irregular warfare, growing importance of civilian areas and actors, less direct armed confrontation between states. You use proxies rather than state armies fighting against each other because you want to avoid an all-out war between countries. And widening of gray zones of unconventional operations. So you use unconventional means in order to achieve your goal. So hybrid warfare may become the preferred tool for state actors. What is very interesting in this respect, nobody in the world calls what they are doing hybrid warfare. There's not a single state that has ever said, we used hybrid methods. It's negatively defined. Hybrid warfare is something that is fishy, you shouldn't do it, it's dirty. Everybody does it, but you don't call it this way. The Russians don't call it hybrid warfare, the Americans don't call it hybrid warfare. It's only used against the enemy, against the adversary. The enemy is using hybrid warfare. We are, of course, only using clean methods. That is something you find everywhere. That's why this term is only used negatively. There is no hybrid warfare command that is preparing hybrid warfare for the NATO. There is, however, a center of excellence in Helsinki that is analyzing hybrid warfare, but it's not preparing hybrid warfare for NATO. And as I said, the Russians themselves officially don't have a hybrid warfare command as well, because they, of course, following the Gerasimov doctrine. So what are the possible counter strategies? How can we stop hybrid warfare? In the case of Ukraine, we had a new definition of the OSCE. You know, the OSCE was actually founded in the Cold War, and after the Cold War it was not really clear what we are doing with this organization. But since the United Nations was not working, because the United Nations can only work when the permanent member of the Security Council agree on something, and if Russia is part to the conflict, of course they will not agree to a resolution of the conflict that is against their will. It was found out that the OSCE can probably be a lower level organization. So as a result, you have in eastern Ukraine observers not from the United Nations, but observers from the OSCE. It's not a perfect solution, but it's better to have observers instead of having no observers in this region. Then one important task for us as scientists is the exposure of plausible deniability. If the Russians say we don't have troops there, we have to prove that they have troops there. Doesn't matter whether they have insignia, just take pictures of the fighters, run them through databases and found out this is a colonel of the Russian army. And that's actually what was done. So piece by piece it was clear that regular and highly trained Russian forces were there. Another thing is whether we can use certain international agreements. For example, the Friendly Relations Resolution of the UN General Assembly, or whether we can bring people, not people, states, to commit not to support irregular forces in another country. The Declaration on the Principles of International Law concerning Friendly Relations is very clear, and it says, a war of aggression constitutes a crime against the peace for which there is responsibility under international law. And every state has a duty to refrain from organizing or encouraging the organization of irregular forces or armed bands, including mercenaries, for the incursion into the territory of of another state. So in law, it's quite easy. We have this declaration, and according to this declaration, we cannot use irregular forces. But maybe it's very naive to think that this will not happen, since it worked so well in so many cases. counter strategies are strengthening of regional organizations as OSCE, ASEAN in conflicts in Asia, thinking, for example, about what happens at the moment in Myanmar or Burma, or the African Union in Africa. Then we can still dream about a reform of the United Nations. I don't know whether you will see this in your lifetime. I'm pretty sure I will not see this in my lifetime, but let's keep some optimism. And of course to find new formats of conflict transformation, how we can avoid violent conflicts. Some examples: in Ukraine we had several new formats, the Normandy format. Normandy because it was in this part of France where Germany, France, Russia and Ukraine came together and discussed the problem in Ukraine. Then the OSCE again, the Eastern Partnership, a program that actually is developed by NATO, but of course it shall send out clear messages and not half-hearted messages about what we're actually offering the partners in the East. Then, as we saw in the conflict in Syria, in Iraq, and in fighting against ISIS, the Iran negotiations P5+1 were actually outside of the format of the United Nations. States came together with Iran and negotiated contract under which Iran will abandon its capacity to build atomic weapons or nuclear weapons. And of course, as I already mentioned, we need a reform of the Security Council, but of course the permanent members of the Security Council don't want it, and without their acceptance we won't have these reforms. And of course new responsibilities for regional organizations. I tried to write, for example, something about it, so you can read it in the Security and Human Rights Journal, International Crisis Management and Human Security in the Framework of Hybrid Wars, and what kind of lessons we learned from Ukraine, some of the ideas I put into this presentation. So let me summarize. The term hybrid warfare has often been criticized as insufficient and inaccurate. As I said, it's not used positively by anybody who's using it, but it's still the predominant one. So we have to stick to this when we are talking about this kind of warfare. It is not new, but it appears progressively more in a new version. It's more effective than it used to be. Hybrid warfare complicates the use of classic conflict transformation mechanisms, since major actors attempt to hide their roles as parties in the conflict. Putin, for example, says he has nothing to do with Ukraine conflict. It's an internal conflict of Ukraine, and Putin is only helping to solve the problem. So it's very difficult to make a negotiation with Putin if he says I have nothing to do with it. Whether I'm signing something or not, doesn't matter. I'm not party to the conflict. It's quite difficult, of course, then to come to a classical conference and solve the conflict. Regional organizations and informal stakeholders gain increased importance as mediators in time when conventional international organizations, I mentioned it, the UN, are disabled due to strategic and structural self-blockades. This is even more the case in situation of hybrid conflicts where the categories friend, foe and neutral are blurred. We don't really know who is who and who acts on which behalf. And so to find the way out of the conflict is sometimes extremely difficult. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.